So, in the Darfur conflict, which, raged through the early 2000s, researchers estimate that nearly 300,000 people died.
Right. It's a staggering number.
It is. But, and here is the most terrifying statistic you are going to hear today. 4 out of 5 of those people were never shot.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, they survived the militias. They escaped their burning villages. They made it all the way through the desert to the supposed safety of an internationally funded aid camp. And then they died anyway.
It completely changes how you think about war, doesn't it?
Exactly. So today we're exploring the invisible killers of modern warfare and really the hidden architecture of human suffering. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here. Because, when you look at a disaster on television, whether it's a collapsed city after an earthquake or a literal war zone, the overwhelming impression is just a total absence of order.
Right. It just looks like pure chaos.
It looks like a void where logic just doesn't apply anymore. But beneath that smoke and rubble, there are actually mathematical and epidemiological patterns. And reading those patterns is really the only way to actually stop the dying.
Which is our mission for this deep dive. We want to look past those dramatic headlines and understand how public health officials and statisticians actually measure the true human cost of catastrophic events. Like, how does data gathered right in the middle of an active war zone act as a literal lifeline?
It's fascinating. And to do this, we've got a really incredible stack of sources today. 3 foundational academic papers.
Yeah, let's run through those. We're starting with a 1976 paper by Michael F. Lechat. This one really laid the groundwork for the epidemiology of disasters.
Right, it's a classic. And then from there, we move into a 1995 paper by Weinberg and Simmons. And this one analyzes public health data collection under fire, specifically during the Bosnian War.
Yeah, that one is intense. And finally, we're going to unpack this highly detailed 2010 study by Degome and Guasapir. They used some incredibly complex statistical modeling to analyze mortality rates in Darfur.
Which is where that statistic you mentioned earlier comes from. We really have to completely rewire how we view emergency response.
What do you mean by rewire?
Well, we are so conditioned to think of rescue as an individual act, right? Like someone physically pulling a person from the debris.
Right, the firefighter carrying someone out of a burning building.
Exactly. We rarely think of rescue as, say, a statistician recognizing a data anomaly and redirecting a supply chain of water purification tablets before an outbreak decimates a refugee camp.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even begin to understand how to count the dead in a war zone, we kind of need to establish what a disaster actually is, from a biological and societal perspective.
Yeah, and Lechat's 1976 paper draws a very hard line right away on this.
He does. He basically says a disaster is not the earthquake, it's not the hurricane.
Right, which sounds counterintuitive. But Lechat defines a disaster specifically as a situation that implies an unforeseen, serious, and immediate threat to public health that the affected community simply cannot cope with.
Cannot cope with. That's the key, right?
That's the functional core of the definition, the inability to cope. If a community can handle the aftermath using their own internal resources, it's a localized crisis. A true disaster inherently requires external assistance.
So it's essentially the collision between a physical hazard and a vulnerable society.
Exactly.
And we can actually look at historical variants to prove this. Like the sources mentioned, the 1931 Yellow River floods in China. That killed millions of people.
Millions.
And then the 1970 East Bengal floods, which killed at least 224,000. And in East Bengal, a significant factor was actually a delayed warning.
Right, which was partially the result of a previous false alarm.
Yeah. The authorities hesitated because they had cried wolf before, and the population was caught completely exposed.
And you contrast those staggering death tolls with the 1964 Anchorage, Alaska earthquake.
Oh, this blew my mind.
Right. At the time, it was the strongest earthquake ever recorded on the North American continent. It measured over 8.4 on the Richter scale.
Which is just massive.
It unleashed tsunamis, it literally liquefied the ground beneath the city, and yet the death toll was only 115 people.
115. And then just 8 years later, you have the 1972 Managua earthquake in Nicaragua, which was
a significantly less powerful seismic event.
Right. But it killed roughly 5,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands.
Exactly. The Anchorage hazard was objectively more violent. But the Managua event was a greater disaster.
So disaster isn't really the earthquake itself, it's the vulnerability of the society. Like how a flat tire on your car is a 10-minute annoyance. If you're in a brightly lit parking lot, you have a spare tire in the trunk,
Yeah.
and you know how to use a jack.
Right, it's an inconvenience.
But if you suffer that exact same mechanical failure in the middle of Death Valley in July, and you don't have a spare, and you don't have water, it is a lethal crisis.
That is a perfect analogy. The flat tire is identical, but the vulnerability dictates the outcome.
So where does that vulnerability come from?
Well, it's intrinsically tied to what Lechat calls disaster culture.
Disaster culture.
Yeah. Throughout history, populations that are repeatedly exposed to specific hazards develop complex social adaptations. If you look at European towns with frequent mining disasters during the Industrial Revolution, or communities on Pacific atolls that face seasonal typhoons, the populations don't panic when the event occurs.
Was they're used to it.
Right. They have a pre-established social choreography. Everyone knows their specific role in the immediate aftermath.
But if you're listening to this, you might be wondering, why on earth would anyone rebuild a town on a known fault line? Or refuse to move from a floodplain? Lechat actually addresses this directly, doesn't he?
He does. And it almost always comes down to structural realities. Poverty, population density, historical land rights. I mean, there's often literally nowhere else for them to go.
Right.
Or the economic benefit of the location, like fertile volcanic soil or a critical river delta, simply outweighs the abstract future risk of a hazard.
But there's also a profound psychological component to vulnerability, especially when dealing with unprecedented hazards. Our brains are just remarkably adept at filtering out information that threatens our baseline reality.
Oh, normalcy bias is incredibly strong.
Yeah, and there's an anecdote in the sources that illustrates this perfectly. I mean, it is almost unbelievable.
Well, volcano story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was this community living near a volcano, and the volcano had completely wiped out the settlement 80 years prior.
So no living resident had actually experienced the eruption, but the historical record was definitely there.
Right. They knew what it was. But when the volcano began to show obvious physical signs of an impending eruption, tremors, lights, sounds, the locals did not evacuate. They literally sat outside at night, playing cards and watching the mountain.
And when researchers later asked the survivors why they didn't flee, the residents explained that they thought the lights and sounds were a flying saucer landing on the neighboring island.
With Martians aboard.
Yes. They invented a science fiction scenario to explain away an immediate geological threat.
I mean, they literally chose Martians over an eruption.
Because normalcy bias is a powerful evolutionary mechanism. I mean, our brains are wired to assume that things will continue as they always have. When you're confronted with an event so far outside the realm of daily experience, something that requires immediate, terrifying, life-altering action, like abandoning your home forever, the mind will sometimes manufacture an absurd fiction rather than process the apocalyptic reality.
That makes a weird kind of sense. Processing a Martian landing requires no action. You just watch. But processing a volcanic eruption requires leaving everything you own behind.
Exactly. So human psychology often prevents us from acting. But what happens the moment the disaster actually strikes?
Right, because Lechat talks about the immediate aftermath, and he introduces a concept called the second disaster.
Yes. And this completely upends the conventional image we have from movies.
Right. In the movies, the local population is instantly rendered helpless. They're wandering around in a daze, waiting for the military or international aid organizations to fly in and save them.
But the data contradicts that narrative entirely. Within 30 minutes of a major disaster, like a seismic collapse, up to 75% of the healthy survivors are already actively engaged in highly efficient rescue activities.
75%.
Yes, because they know who lived in the collapsed apartment building. They know the floor plans. They know who was likely at work and who was at home.
So they are pulling their neighbors from the rubble using their bare hands and whatever tools they can scavenge.
Exactly. The local survivors are the primary first responders, every single time.
So then what is the second disaster?
The second disaster occurs when the international response actually hinders that local efficiency.
Wait, how does help hinder them?
Because within 24 to 48 hours, you have uninvited, unskilled foreign volunteers flooding the zone. You have medical students flying in from London or New York wanting to help. You have independent rescue workers arriving without briefings, without local language skills, and without logistical support.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that.
Yeah, and they require food, they require housing, they require translators and transport. So they end up monopolizing the exact resources that the local survivors desperately need. They effectively choke the recovery effort.
They become a logistical nightmare for a system that has already lost its capacity to cope.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is that this is exactly why Lechat was arguing back in 1976 that epidemiology must systematically study disaster-struck populations.
Because at the time, people didn't think you could study them.
Right. He was fiercely pushing back against this prevailing attitude that disasters are simply too chaotic and too diverse to study scientifically. People used to say, every disaster is different, you can't measure it.
But Lechat argued that we have to measure attack rates. We have to evaluate the actual efficacy of relief efforts. We have to bring rigorous scientific method into the chaos, specifically to prevent that second disaster.
Exactly, because if we accept that disasters can be studied, we can predict what a population will actually need. We can stop sending random assortments of expired medications and start sending what is statistically required.
Okay, so Lechat established that disasters can and should be studied. But we need to transition from natural disasters to man-made ones.
Yes, the Weinberg and Simmons paper from 1995.
Right, because if Lechat established the theoretical mandate, this paper shows us the terrifying reality of trying to implement that surveillance in a modern war zone.
And we have to contextualize how the sheer demographics of warfare have changed over the last century to understand this.
This part of the source was chilling.
It really is. Weinberg and Simmons highlight a devastating statistical trend. In World War I, civilian casualties accounted for roughly 10% of the total deaths.
10%. Because the fighting was mostly in trenches and battlefields, far from the cities.
Right. But by World War II, with the advent of strategic bombing and the movement of front lines through populated areas, civilian deaths climbed to 50%.
Half.
And in subsequent modern conflicts, civilians make up 80% of the casualties.
80%. The battlefield is no longer a geographical field. It's a dense urban center. It's a neighborhood. It's a hospital.
Modern war has shifted into complex emergencies where combatants are deeply embedded within civilian populations. And furthermore, the infrastructure necessary to keep those civilians alive, water treatment plants, electrical grids, healthcare facilities, these are routinely treated as legitimate tactical targets by combatants aiming to destabilize the opposing society.
Which brings us to the Yugoslav wars, specifically Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1992 and 1993. And before we get into the numbers, I want to be entirely clear for you listening. Our discussion here is looking strictly at the public health logistics and the epidemiological data collection.
Right.
The WHO operated under strict neutrality. They treated health crises based purely on biological need across all territories. So we are looking at data collection in Serbian Sarajevo, in Banja Luka, and in government-controlled Sarajevo alike. The shifting political borders and military factions, we're only looking at them as variables that either blocked or permitted the physical movement of public health workers. We are not taking sides.
And frankly, that operational neutrality was the only reason the WHO could function there at all.
Because before the war, they actually had a good system, right?
A highly sophisticated one. Prior to the outbreak of the war, the former Yugoslavia maintained a very comprehensive epidemiological monitoring system. But by the time the conflict escalated in 1992, that system had virtually disintegrated within Bosnia-Herzegovina.
The communication lines were cut, the clinics were destroyed.
Or isolated. So the WHO entered this environment with a singular first priority. They had to reestablish an early warning surveillance system for epidemic threats.
But their first attempt to do this was, well, it was a complete structural failure.
It was. They tried to set up what are called sentinel sites.
Right. What exactly is a sentinel site?
They're standard public health tools. You designate specific clinics or outposts run or heavily monitored by international staff to act as tripwires. They collect standardized data on disease presentations so you can spot an outbreak early.
Like, oh, we have 5 cases of cholera here, let's stop it before it's 500.
Exactly.
But trying to drop a pristine international bureaucratic system into a city under siege completely fell apart.
Completely. First of all, the international staff physically could not reach the sentinel sites because of active shelling and shifting front lines.
That makes sense.
But the secondary failure is much more interesting. Imagine you are a local clinician in a makeshift trauma ward in Sarajevo. The power is out. You have patients arriving with shrapnel wounds, traumatic amputations, crush injuries from collapsed buildings.
Right, mass casualties.
And an international aid worker manages to get through the barricades to hand you a highly detailed multi-page form asking you to document every case of a common cold, a minor rash, or a mild fever.
I mean, I would probably throw the clipboard at them.
Exactly. To a surgeon dealing with mass casualties, tracking upper respiratory infections feels offensively irrelevant. The WHO was asking exhausted local doctors to perform administrative tasks that took time away from actually saving lives.
And on top of that, the WHO wasn't returning any analysis to those doctors.
No, the local clinicians were sending data into an international black hole. They saw zero practical benefit for their own patients. So consequently, by May of 1993, Sentinel site reporting ceased entirely.
They just stopped filling out the forms.
Yep. They realized that imposing an external parallel system on top of a traumatized local infrastructure was arrogant and functionally useless.
So the WHO pivoted. They realized they needed to use the remnants of the system that was already there.
Exactly. They located the pre-war regional institutes of public health in places like Sarajevo, Tuzla, Zenica, and Banja Luka. And the local epidemiologists in these institutes were still working.
They were just isolated.
Yes, they were still desperately trying to collect data from their peripheral clinics. What they lacked wasn't the expertise or the desire, they lacked the physical means to transmit the information.
Because the phone lines were down and the roads were impassable.
Right. So the WHO effectively became a highly dangerous courier service.
I love this detail. They utilized non-governmental organizations and field monitors who had security clearances to cross checkpoints.
Yes. These monitors physically carried the epidemiological data on paper from the isolated clinics back to the regional institutes.
They empowered the local experts by providing the logistical bridge that the war had destroyed.
And once those physical pieces of paper started arriving at the institutes, the data painted an incredibly alarming picture.
Yeah, the infectious disease rates were skyrocketing, specifically water-related diseases. They tracked massive spikes in hepatitis A, scabies, and enterocolitis.
Enterocolitis is brutal.
Yeah, can you explain what that does to the body?
Sure. It's a severe inflammation of both the small intestine and the colon. It's usually caused by bacterial infections like Salmonella or E. coli from consuming contaminated food or water. It causes rapid, severe diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pain.
Which, in a healthy society, is treatable.
Very treatable. But in a war zone, the resulting dehydration is lethal. The notification rates for these diseases shot up exponentially compared to the pre-war baselines. What the epidemiologists were seeing wasn't just a list of sick people, they were reading the mathematical signature of a collapsing sanitary infrastructure.
The sewage systems were failing.
And the clean water supply was compromised.
And the sources highlight a specific vital data point regarding collective centers.
Yes, this is crucial.
These were large building schools, sports halls, abandoned factories where displaced refugees were housed. And in one specific monitored region, refugees made up only about 10% of the total population.
But those refugees accounted for almost half of all the recorded cases of enterocolitis.
Half? From just 10% of the population.
And drilling down even further, almost 2/3 of those specific refugee cases were concentrated among people living in the collective centers, rather than those who had found shelter in private homes.
It demonstrated a highly localized, extreme vulnerability. The density of people in those centers, combined with the lack of functioning plumbing, it created a biological pressure cooker.
Absolutely.
Okay, wait. I want to pause here and challenge the premise of this entire operation.
Okay, go for it.
We are talking about a literal war zone. There are snipers, there's artillery fire, people are being blown apart. Why are public health officials expending precious, limited resources and risking the lives of couriers crossing checkpoints just to count diarrhea cases in a sports hall? I mean, shouldn't every single resource, every dollar, every truck, every helicopter flight be focused entirely on trauma surgery, blood transfusions, and stopping the physical bleeding?
It is the most common, intuitive argument against epidemiological work in conflict zones. Why count when you can operate?
Exactly.
But if you only focus on trauma surgery, you are only treating the visible wounds of the conflict. You are ignoring the invisible secondary wave of mortality that is mathematically guaranteed to follow.
The second disaster.
Yes. The data is the ultimate advocacy tool. Without the data, international humanitarian aid relies entirely on assumptions.
So how does that actually play out on the ground? like practically?
Well, imagine the international donor community watching the news. They see bombs falling on a city. Their immediate logical instinct is to send surgical kits, bandages, and trauma surgeons.
Which are needed.
Absolutely necessary. But the local epidemiologists look at the data from the collective centers and realize that an outbreak of dysentery is imminent. By presenting hard, verified data proving that enterocolitis is ravaging these specific buildings, the WHO can go to the UN and the donor nations and say, we have enough bandages. We desperately need pallets of oral rehydration salts. We need industrial water purification units.
Oh, I see.
We need to deploy targeted health education regarding sanitation to these exact GPS coordinates. They use the data to redirect the massive machinery of international aid exactly where it is needed to prevent a secondary mass casualty event.
So they had to mathematically prove that the tap water was becoming just as deadly as the artillery.
Exactly. If they hadn't been counting those cases, cholera or severe dysentery could have swept through those collective centers and killed thousands of people silently. The deaths would have been lost in the noise of the war.
Wow. Okay, so Bosnia showed us that local data collection can save lives in a besieged city. But what happens when you don't have a city at all?
Right. What if there's no remaining infrastructure?
Exactly. What happens when millions of displaced people are wandering across an area the size of France and there are no local clinics left to gather the data?
That is the methodological nightmare researchers faced in Darfur.
Which brings us to the 2000 DCCM and Guha Sapir paper.
And here we're shifting from real-time data collection, like the couriers in Bosnia, to retrospective analysis.
Retrospective. Looking back.
Right. How do epidemiologists look back at a multi-year, highly complex conflict and calculate the true human cost after the fact?
And the Darfur conflict is staggeringly vast. The data we are looking at spans from 2003 to 2008. And just to reiterate, to maintain our strict focus on the data, we are only mentioning the political milestones provided in the source, such as the International Criminal Court warrant for Sudan's president, or the May 2006 Darfur peace agreement with the Mini-Manawi faction, strictly as timeline markers.
Yes.
We mention them solely because these events dictated when international aid agencies were allowed into certain regions and when they were forced to evacuate. We are tracking the access, not the politics.
It's an important distinction because gathering data in Darfur was a monumental logistical challenge. Over those 5 years, various non-governmental organizations and health agencies conducted 107 retrospective mortality surveys.
107.
Right. They would go into camps or villages and systematically ask families about who had died, when, and how.
But the researchers in this 2010 study didn't just take all 107 surveys and add the numbers together, which is what I would have assumed they'd do.
No, you cannot just aggregate the raw data because the quality of data gathered in a crisis is wildly variable.
I mean, that makes sense. A survey conducted under fire by exhausted aid workers might have flawed methodology.
Exactly. So DCCM and Guha Sapir applied incredibly rigorous scientific filters. They checked the sampling methods. They ensured that households were selected randomly and properly. They recalculated the mortality rates to standardize them. They had to mathematically estimate the effect of inaccessible areas, places where no aid worker could safely go. And after this exhaustive filtering, they threw out a significant portion of the data. They narrowed it down to 63 highly reliable surveys that contained all the necessary variables.
Okay, so they have these 63 golden surveys, and to analyze this refined data set, they use a statistical tool called a quasi-Poisson regression model.
Right.
Which sounds incredibly intimidating. I mean, I understand basic averages, but what does a quasi-Poisson model actually do?
Yeah.
And why do they need it here?
Let's break it down. A standard Poisson model named after a French mathematician is generally used to predict the probability of a given number of events occurring in a fixed interval of time.
Okay.
But it assumes those events happen at a constant rate and independently of each other. Think of it like predicting how many meteors you might see during a meteor shower per hour.
Right. If I see a meteor at 10 p.m., it doesn't make it more likely that I'll see one at 10:41 p.m. They are independent.
Exactly. But deaths in a war zone don't happen at a constant independent rate.
Oh, right. Because if one person dies of cholera in a camp, the person sleeping next to them is significantly more likely to die of cholera.
Precisely. Or if a militia attacks a village, you don't have a steady trickle of mortality, you have a massive sudden spike. In statistics, this is called overdispersion.
Overdispersed.
The variance in the data is much greater than the mean. The deaths are clumping together in huge, unpredictable spikes depending on the specific location and time period.
So a standard model would completely misread the reality on the ground.
Yes. The standard model would assume a smooth curve that just doesn't exist. So the quasi-Poisson model introduces a parameter that accounts for that extreme variance. It allows the researchers to accurately model the clustered nature of the deaths. It factors in exactly when the survey was done, the specific geographic state, and crucially, what percentage of the sample population were internally displaced persons, or IDPs.
Okay, so once they built this highly specialized model, they had to calculate what they call excess deaths.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this, this is the foundational concept for understanding the true cost of any conflict or pandemic.
Yes.
Excess deaths.
An excess death is a fatality that would not have occurred if the event, in this case the war, had not happened. To find that number, you first have to establish a baseline.
Right.
You have to ask a very grim question. In a normal, peaceful year in this specific region, how many people would we expect to die from natural causes, old age, or endemic diseases?
So you take the total number of dead you have counted,
Okay.
and you subtract the expected number of dead from the baseline. And the resulting number is the blood on the hands of the conflict.
Exactly. And Degomé and Gossipir used two different baselines to ensure their estimates were robust. First, they used a standard sub-Saharan African baseline, which is 0.44 deaths per 10,000 people per day.
0.44 per 10,000 per day.
Right. And using that math, they calculated approximately 210,607 excess death over the 5-year period.
210,000.
But they also ran the model using a more localized historical baseline, specifically for Sudan, which was slightly lower, 0.3 deaths per 10,000 people per day.
Okay, and with that localized baseline.
The excess death toll jumps to 298,271 out of roughly 486,121 total deaths.
So nearly 300,000 people dead directly because of the conflict.
Yes.
But the sheer volume of fatalities, as horrifying as it is not the most crucial finding of this paper.
No, it's not.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The true revelation, the data point that completely changes how we must view humanitarian intervention, emerges when they broke the conflict down into 6 distinct chronological periods and examined the cause of death.
Right. Let's look at period 2. This window ran from September 2003 to March 2004. This was when the kinetic fighting really intensified across the region.
The active violence.
Yes. During period 2, the crude mortality rate, the overall death rate across the population, was astronomical. It spiked up to 10 times higher than the expected baseline.
10.
And during this specific early window, those deaths were driven heavily by violence. It matches our standard understanding of a war. An initial horrific spike in violent trauma.
But after the spring of 2004, moving into period 3 in the subsequent years, the overall mortality rates dropped from that initial violent peak.
They dropped, yes.
But they stayed significantly higher than the baseline, meaning people were still dying at a highly elevated rate. But the cause of death completely flipped.
Yes. Over the entire 5-year course of the conflict studied, more than 80% of the total excess deaths were not from violence.
80%.
They were from disease. And specifically, they were from diarrhea-related diseases.
This is the statistic from the top of the deep dive. 4 out of every 5 people who died as a direct result of the Darfur conflict did not die from a bullet. They did not die from an airstrike.
No.
They died from consuming contaminated water and living in environments with catastrophic sanitation failures.
And this brings us to a phenomenon we can call the IDP paradox.
The IDP paradox.
Yes. The statistical models revealed a very strong, incredibly grim correlation regarding internally displaced people.
Right. The data showed that if you lived in a camp with a high proportion of IDPs, you were actually statistically less likely to die from violence.
Because you had successfully escaped the roaming militias, you were behind a perimeter fence, you had some nominal protection from international peacekeepers, or simply the deterrent presence of international aid workers.
But by entering that supposed sanctuary, you became significantly more likely to die from communicable diseases.
Exactly. You survived the initial attack on your village, but now you are in an overcrowded camp. Building an IDP camp of 50,000 people is essentially building a mid-sized city overnight.
Right, but without the infrastructure.
Exactly. Without laying down a single sewer pipe, without pouring a concrete foundation, and without tapping a secure treated aquifer. It is like forcing 50,000 people to live inside a single giant cruise ship where the plumbing has completely failed, the toilets are overflowing into the hallways, and the only drinking water is pulled from the lower decks.
Oh my God. So escaping a raided village to reach an IDP camp is like jumping out of a burning building into a freezing river.
Yes.
You survived the fire, but now you're fighting a completely different invisible threat. The sheer density of human bodies changes the biological math. If one person gets sick in an isolated desert village, the disease might just burn out.
Right, it has nowhere to spread.
But if one person gets sick in an IDP camp, the viral or bacterial load in the shared environment skyrockets instantly. The hazard simply changed from kinetic violence to biological threat. And because the population was traumatized, malnourished, and impossibly dense, the disaster threshold was breached almost immediately.
And if disease is the primary killer in displaced populations, the solution seems mechanically obvious, right? We need humanitarian aid. We need industrial water bladders, chlorine tablets, massive shipments of food, and antibiotics. The Darfur data provides a terrifyingly clear mathematical picture of what happens when that aid supply chain fluctuates. It proves that aid is not just a gesture of goodwill. It is a literal structural load-bearing wall holding up the population.
Which brings us to period 5 of the study, covering July 2006 to September 2007. The researchers noticed a massive anomaly in the data here.
That they did.
During this window, the levels of kinetic violence across Darfur were continuing to decrease. The fighting was subsiding.
So you would naturally expect the overall death rate to decrease alongside the violence.
Exactly, but instead, the crude mortality rate spiked, and specifically, the diarrhea-related deaths surged.
So if the shooting is stopping, why are more people dying?
Right.
To answer that, we have to pull back and look at the United Nations operational data from the exact same period. During period 5, the total number of affected people in Darfur, people displaced from their homes who completely relied on the camps for survival, rose from 3.5 million to 4.2 million.
So you have an influx of hundreds of thousands of highly vulnerable people into the camps.
Right. But at the exact same time, the number of humanitarian aid workers operating in Darfur actually decreased by 18%.
They lost over 2,500 aid workers. The staff dropped from 14,751 down to 12,122.
The math is brutal. The ratio of affected people to aid workers surged. It went from 237 people relying on a single staff member up to 346 people per staff member.
The safety net was stretched by a massive influx of weight while the ropes holding it up were simultaneously cut.
Exactly.
But why? Why did the staff leave if there were more people to help?
The sources highlight two intersecting factors. First, localized insecurity and bureaucratic hurdles made certain regions simply inaccessible.
Yeah.
But more importantly, there were massive international funding shortages. The global money was drying up. It got so bad that in early 2006, the World Food Program literally had to cut daily food rations in Darfur by 50% because they simply did not have the funds to buy the grain.
50%. They cut their food in half.
Yes. And we see the immediate fatal consequence in the epidemiological data. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the very moment the aid funding drops, the disease-related mortality rate spikes.
Wow.
The Quasi-Poisson model proves unequivocally that the physical presence of aid workers, the active water sanitation efforts, and the daily food distributions were the only things holding back a tidal wave of disease deaths in these camps.
It is the exact same underlying mechanism we saw in Bosnia.
Yes, exactly.
When the WHO mathematically proved the need and targeted enterocolitis in the collective centers, they saved lives. In Darfur, when the funding for that exact kind of basic sanitation and food aid was withdrawn, the population collapsed.
Which forces us to ask a very difficult question about the psychology of international donors and global attention. Why does the funding dry up while millions of people are still trapped in the crisis?
Yeah. I think it comes down to psychological distance and the mechanics of what makes the evening news.
Right.
People donate money when they see dramatic, violent images. When a conflict is in period 2, when there is footage of villages burning, refugees fleeing across the desert, columns of smoke, the visual urgency triggers a massive influx of donations.
Because it looks like an emergency.
But when the violence subsides into what aid organizations term a stabilization period, the news cameras pack up and leave.
Because a stabilization period does not look like an emergency on television. It looks static. It's drone footage of millions of people living in rows of white tents. There is no active kinetic event to broadcast.
The data tells us that stabilization does not mean safe. It simply means the cause of death has shifted from the visible trauma of violence to the invisible trauma of severe diarrhea and malnutrition.
Right.
But the donors are gone. The attention has shifted to the next crisis. The funding dries up, the aid agencies are forced to lay off staff and cut rations, and the IDPs are left to face the most lethal phase of the disaster, completely alone.
It is a profound, tragic disconnect between the public perception of a disaster and the biological reality of its aftermath. The public assumes the disaster ends when the peace treaty is signed or the shooting stops. The epidemiologist looking at the data knows that the disaster is just entering its most entrenched, lethal phase.
So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening to this, care? Why take an hour to wade through historical mortality rates, regression models, and the grim realities of these disaster zones?
Because whether you are looking at the aftermath of an earthquake in Managua, a freezing collective center in besieged Sarajevo, or an overflowing IDP camp in Darfur, the fundamental truth remains the same.
Right.
Counting the dead is not a cold academic exercise. Public health data and epidemiology are the most vital tools we have. They are the only reliable way to cut through the chaos of a collapsed society, effectively protect the living, direct resources where they will actually alter the outcome, and hold the international community accountable when they try to withdraw aid prematurely.
The data is the enduring voice of the victims who can no longer speak.
Exactly. It cuts through the political narratives, it cuts through the donor fatigue, and it tells us exactly what is failing.
That is powerfully said.
Hmm.
But I want to leave you with a final thought today, and it requires circling all the way back to Michel Lechat's 1976 paper.
Oh, let's hear it.
Lechat noted that in disaster cultures, those historical communities repeatedly struck by typhoons or earthquakes, everyone in the community knows exactly what to do when the crisis hits.
They have communal resilience.
Right. But in our modern, highly differentiated, technologically dependent Western societies, we do not have that communal knowledge. We rely entirely on specialized experts. When the power grid fails, we don't know how to fix it. We wait for the utility technicians.
Right.
When there is a fire, we wait for the fire department. When the water supply is contaminated, we rely on the government to truck in bottles.
Our societal resilience is almost entirely outsourced to infrastructure that we do not personally understand or control.
Precisely. So as our society becomes increasingly specialized, increasingly reliant on delicate technological supply chains, and further disconnected from basic communal survival skills, are we inadvertently engineering ourselves to be less resilient to the massive climate and infrastructure disasters of the future than the historically disaster-prone communities we so often try to assist?
Oh, wow.
When the hazard finally overwhelms our infrastructure, will we be the ones staring at the floodwaters, waiting for experts who are never going to arrive, completely incapable of coping when the system finally breaks?
That is a terrifying and entirely necessary question for us to ask ourselves.
Something to ponder the next time the lights flicker in your house. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. We will see you next time.